Thanks. I know Caitlin's not able to take questions today. Up next, I want to introduce my friend James Lee, COO from the ID Theft Resource Center, who will be unveiling their data breach report. Very important. Before he comes up here, this is the second year in a row we've done this event on January 25th. So I'm going to embarrass him again because that also happens to be his birthday. He's spending it for the second year in a row talking about the misery of data breaches with us rather than doing something more fun. So everybody please say on the count of three, 1, 2, 3, happy birthday, James.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. And appreciate the birthday thoughts. Hey, Ken, how are you? I was sitting right behind you, didn't even know it. Before we get to the actual numbers, this is our 18th edition of this particular report. We've been tracking data breaches since 2005. And for those of you who don't know who the Identity Theft Resource Center is, this is our 25th year. As a nonprofit, our primary mission is to provide victim assistance to victims of identity crimes for free. And then we have a secondary mission that involves research and providing information to policymakers, to business leaders, and to the general public about trends around identity and identity crimes. Normally, I'm a bit of a smartass. At this point, I would probably make some joke, but I'm not going to do it this year because when I unveil these numbers, I'm going to tell you right now, we've all become a little bit numb to seeing a little bit of an increase every year. And both in the attack vectors and how these are exploited and the impacts, what I'm about to show you is a step change. It is an exponential increase. And some of the reasons behind it, we will yet to determine. We'll have to see if these trends continue. But if they continue, there is something fundamentally different going on right now. And as defenders, we got to figure out what that is and what we can do to help mitigate it, because we are on a very, very steep trajectory from this point forward. So just to point out a few things, if you only remember one thing, as one of my mentors said, remember this: we set an all-time high, but the estimated number of victims dropped. The number of breach notices with no actionable information jumped significantly year over year. And we saw a lot of growth in both supply chain and zero-day attacks. That zero-day is what really concerns me at the end of the day, because we've gone from zero-day attacks that you can count on your hand and have fingers left over to a significant number. All right, so let's get after it. Data breaches grew 72% over the previous all-time high, which was set in 2021. So we've gone year over year from 1,800-ish data breaches to 3,200-ish data breaches. Those are publicly reported breaches in the United States. It took us 15 years to get every state to have a data breach notice law, along with the territories and the District of Columbia. It took 11 years to get to 1,000 data breaches in a single year. We blew through 2,000, blew through 3,000 in 1 year. So you can see the trajectory over time. And really from this point forward, what we're going to start doing is focusing on 2018 forward, because that was the year when everybody had a data breach notice law. So we're all on the same playing field at that point. Before that, you had cats and dogs who didn't have a data breach notice law. So, you couldn't have a true apples to apples comparison. Now we can. So 3,205 in the last calendar year. From a victim perspective, if you're looking for the pony, here it is. It's still not great, because you're looking at a total number of victims of 353 million. That includes obviously duplicates, but 353 million in the last calendar year. But that's down 84% from when we set an all-time high in 2018, 2018 being a year when you had some very, very large data breaches. And at that time, the attack vector du jour of the bad guys was to hoover up as much information from as many sources as humanly possible. That is not what they're doing today. And so we've also seen the drop in the number of people who are impacted during the course of any given year. It is still a 16% decrease year over year. Last year, you had more than 50% of the total victim count from 3 data breaches that all were reported in December of 2022. So a single breach can skew these numbers, very quickly, especially if they happen late in the year. Most of the breaches in 2023 did involve sensitive PII. If you're, it's kind of an eye chart, but if you look at it, it would appear at first glance from 2022 to 2023, we had a 10% drop in the amount of sensitive information breached. Now, what actually happened was we had a 10% increase in breach notices that didn't make a distinction between sensitive and non-sensitive. So we're probably at a stasis level, but you still saw 2,400-ish data breaches that said what was compromised was sensitive PII. So social security numbers, driver's license numbers, passport, account, financial account, et cetera. For the first time, we're reporting the difference between publicly traded companies and everybody else. So what we saw last year was the 358 publicly traded companies issuing data breach notices. That's about 10% of all publicly traded companies. So it's like 9.6%. But it's 11% of all of the breaches from last year. But that 11% in terms of breaches represents 40% of the victims. So public companies, not surprising necessarily, have a disproportionate number of victims associated with what is a relatively small number of data breaches. The rest of those are private organizations, they're government institutions, they're schools, colleges, universities, nonprofits. So the ratio of publicly traded to private organizations is very lopsided. So most of the breach notices are coming from private organizations of one variety or another. If you look at it by industry, here's your top 5. No surprise, for the 6th year in a row, healthcare is the top industry, followed by financial services, because that's where the money is, professional services, manufacturing, and education. There were a couple of areas where we saw big jumps. They didn't necessarily make it into this chart because it didn't rise to that level of the top 5. But you did see, for example, transportation triple in number of breaches, which is an interesting thing because transportation doesn't ordinarily have a lot of PII. It doesn't ordinarily have a lot of information that you would see in a data breach notice. If they have it, it's probably IP. But this year, we saw a lot of transportation organizations saying that they had PII compromised. By victim count, you can see those are individual events, not aggregate. So T-Mobile would be on the list more than once. But that was their single largest breach. It was the single largest breach during the course of the year, followed by Xfinity, came kind of late in the year. And then the one on the bottom, you're going to see a lot of conversation here in a second about Move It. That was a supply chain attack. Now, PBI Research Services was directly attacked. So they were one of the organizations that not only were they impacted, all of their customers were impacted as well, because their customer information was compromised through the supply chain of Move It. Attack vector. No surprise, cyber attacks remain the single largest attack vector. That's been true for at least a decade. When we first started looking at data breaches back in 2005, it would have been reversed between physical attacks and cyber attacks because most everybody was losing paper. It was very much an analog world. Today, 75% of the data breaches are the direct result of a cyber attack. Now, when you dig into that, the top part of this chart shows you, phishing, business email compromise, some variation of a phishing attack. Those are the single largest grouping of cyber attacks, followed by ransomware. And you'll see in both of those cases, slight decrease in each year over year. There are a variety of reasons. Big jump in malware. We're back to good old days of let's write some kind of malware and insert that into a system. So we saw a jump there. 0-day attack. Now in 2021, Mandia tracked 0 days in general. The highest number they had ever tracked was 83 0 days, not necessarily those that would lead to a data breach. 83 0 days, period. We had data breach notices which the organizations self-identified that attack, that breach was a result of a 0-day. 110. That to me, with some of the background in cybersecurity, tells me something fundamentally different is going on with the attackers. They have figured out something, whether they figured out how to automate it, whether they figured out better scanning tools, whether they're just throwing more fingers on keyboards at it. Don't know what, but that's something we need to keep an eye on in this calendar year. So when we have this conversation next year, we can be a lot better educated about what's actually going on. But that is a significant change in the landscape when it comes to data breaches. But then there's that line at the bottom. If you've done the quick math, if you add up all of the various subcategories of cyber attack, they do not equal the number of data breach notices that have no information about what was the root cause of the attack. Now, if we look at that over time, you're going to see that up until 2021, 100% of data breach notices had that information. Since Q4 2021, that number has steadily dropped to now. We're going to talk about it in a second a little bit more, but it's dropped. So supply chains as a trend, supply chain attacks are way up, especially when you look at it over time. So, 82 back in 2018 to 242 supply chain attacks in the last calendar year. But the number of organizations being impacted in those attacks is where the real growth is. It's not just that there are more supply chain attacks, they're impacting more organizations when they occur. So we, nearly doubled the number of organizations impacted by a supply chain attack year over year, along with a big jump, over time. Move It. We all know about Move It. That was the supply chain attack that everybody paid attention to last year. It's the largest one we've ever seen. There were over 1,300, just short of 1,400 organizations that were individually, directly or indirectly impacted by that. There were 102 there. You'll see that they were directly impacted. They were the target of the attack, but by succeeding, they gained access to the other 1,200, almost 1,300 organizations. 25 of those organizations were directly attacked, reported being attacked through multiple vendors. So they had multiple people who were attacked through Move It. And so you also had 13 report that wasn't just their vendor, it was their vendor's vendor that was compromised, which compromised their information. And the two that I always point out to people is these last examples, especially as we look at credential fraud and impersonation scams, impersonation fraud, fueled by something like the entire driver's license databases of Louisiana and Oregon being stolen as part of a Move It attack. There were 42 organizations that said, yep, we had an attack, but we're not going to tell you how. Which leads us to the second trend, and that is, no surprise probably to a lot of folks, data breach laws are ineffective. So the bright line is that 2020 to 2021, where you started to see breach notices contain less and less information. So that 100% from 2005, if we look this back, all the way back to 2020, you had 100% coverage of what actually happened. So other businesses and individuals could make considered decisions about what they need to do if they believe they're in a similar circumstance. That started to drop precipitously. It dropped because of federal court decisions primarily, but also because not all state laws require that information to be shared. A lot of organizations were voluntarily sharing it until such time as you had a couple of the circuit courts go ahead and say you must have proof of actual harm in order to have standing to file the lawsuit as a result of a data breach, which immediately meant to the defense bar, don't say a word. If you don't provide the information, you're not giving discovery before any lawsuit has ever occurred. So you're not giving people the justification to have the litigation. So information drops down to you only provide information that you're statutorily required to do so. Now, how much further that drops, hard to say. If we looked at just the subcomponent of cyber attacks, it's 54% overall. Within cyber attacks, it's closer to 60% do not have information or 40% do. That's a real problem for people who are trying to defend against a similar attack. So we believe that we need to make some changes. Here's another data point about why we need to make changes. We've always known it, at least in our hearts, that not everybody was sharing information. Not everybody was issuing data breach notices when they should. We now have definitive proof. The Blackbaud settlement that came out in the fall of 2023 provided that proof when, as part of the settlement, Blackbaud admitted that 13,000 customer organizations and the data of those 13,000 customer organizations were compromised in the ransomware attack against Blackbaud. Blackbaud never issued a data breach notice. They filed an 8K with the SEC, which the SEC said was inadequate and fraudulent. But there were a subset of the customers who did go ahead and issue data breach notice, 604. So there were, do the quick math, 12,000 plus organizations that never told their customers that their information was compromised. Our data breach laws are inadequate to address what we're seeing in the threat industry today. So, to quote the great Henry Kissinger, we have time. So who has questions for my answers? I'm going to start by asking myself a question. What does this information tell us that we need to do? Well, I'm glad you asked. First of all, a lot of the state data breach laws, let's not even talk about Congress, because we know that's never going to happen. The state data breach laws, the early ones are approaching 20 years old. California's data breach law is 20 years old now. The next wave, which came about in 2005 and 2006, they're coming up on that point. Most of them have not been updated since that time. If they have been updated, it was only to basically add the fact that you may have to notify somebody else in state government that it occurred. But the core of those laws have never been changed. We need to have a uniform, just like we have uniform commercial code, uniform criminal codes. We need a uniform data breach law, and that can flow into regulations as well, where we have common definitions, common triggers, common notice figures, periods, have a report to a state official or a federal official of jurisdiction. There are only 34 states that require someone in government to be notified of a data breach. So in those other states, there could be a major breach, but nobody in the Attorney General's office, nobody in the Consumer Affairs Bureau, None of them ever receive a direct notice. Right now, in Michigan, General Nessel is very exercised over the fact that she learned of the largest data breach in Michigan from a reporter who called her and said, "Did you know?" And she had to say, "No, I did not." Safe harbor, if you follow the rules, unless it's just willful negligence, but safe harbor if you follow the rules, and heavy fines if you fail to follow the rules, just like we have in every other uniform code across the states. We think we need greater supply chain due diligence. You're seeing that in some of the comprehensive privacy and security laws that are being adopted. 11 of the 12 that have been adopted, I'm already counting New Jersey. I think it's still 11 still sitting on the governor's desk, but it includes, just like the others do, a provision for requiring an organization to have their cybersecurity program audited, and they have to report that to a government agency in a state at least once a year. And it also applies to vendors. So we should make that uniform, that your vendor also has to meet the same standard of program equal to the risk to improve supply chain due diligence. We actually have a way you can do that. The ITRC has built a breach alert system. It is free to consumers. It is a paid service for businesses. It is in proof of concept with a global tech company right now, where you can research the historical record of an organization of what data breaches they have had and what they did to remediate them, if anything, and have they had any subsequent to that. And then you will receive an alert going forward. That's important because no state law today requires a business to be notified of a business breach. You may have a contractual obligation that with your vendor, but not your vendor's vendor, and not your vendor's vendor's vendor. But we need to address that. This particular service that we're offering will actually address that. You just load in the name of the vendors and the vendor's vendors, and you get an alert if they ever have a breach. We need to reduce the value of stolen information. Easy to say, difficult to do. In fact, we're going to have a whole panel about this in just a second. But the acceleration of the adoption of mobile driver's licenses, increase in facial comparison, not facial recognition, but biometrics, will make information, when it is compromised, less valuable to the bad guys. When you go to enroll in a government benefit and you know that your face is going to be compared against, say, the face at the DMV, that's really hard to fake. So making information less valuable through more accurate information is going to lead to fewer data breaches. How many? Can't tell you. But the bad guys only steal this stuff because they can make money off of it. They can make money by impersonating people. They can make money committing scams. But if that information is not useful to them, they'll stop stealing it. They'll find something else to do. They'll find something else to steal, but they'll stop stealing that kind of information. Okay. Now we're back to who has questions for my answers, if anybody. Yes, ma'am.
The thing that I think about is a lot of the data broker data that's easily purchased, and how that might be why data is being choose rather than purchasing for $12 on the dollar stuff that benefits overlap data services. I'm just curious if that's part of your study. Big question of mine.
Yeah. So if I heard this correctly, how much, if anything, does this correlate to purchase data? That's sometimes is very similar data, because it's information that can be used to impersonate an individual. We don't really see much correlation. what we do see in the behaviors of the people who commit these crimes is they're cheap. So they would rather steal the information from a data broker than buy it from them. Now, some of them the better organized, better financed, may be purchasing. We do know there are some organizations who are kind of on the line who do purchase information. But the vast majority do not. They would rather steal it and then put it into circulation, because then they can turn around and either sell it or swap it along with the other ways they're going to monetize that information. Somebody over here has a microphone. Yes,
Yeah,
sir.
hi, John Carlson, American Bankers Association. Curious to hear your views on both the positive and negative impact of the SEC public disclosure requirements. And what do you think a year from now your report will look like?
Great question there, because we know, everybody probably knows, the SEC rules went into effect for publicly traded companies back in December. We did see a slight uptick in people trying to get ahead of the rule, which is encouraging. It didn't necessarily change the amount of information and the type of information, because in some cases, they were just that, trying to get ahead of the rule. We'll see if they have more complete 8Ks after. It's all going to come down to materiality. So if they take a very broad view of materiality, then we'll see better 8Ks, we'll see better sources of information than we are seeing generally today. But it is only applicable to publicly traded companies. So again, that's only 9% of this last year's cohort. It's theoretically possible that we could get a little bit of this vendor issue too, because the vendor breach may be material to another organization. So we may see some improvement in information around how the supply chain attack circumstance, how that environment is changing. And that would be very beneficial. So I think we've got to see. I am more excited, frankly, about the New York State Financial Services, the changes they have made, because they are much more granular and they're also much more aggressive at enforcement around data breaches. And that 72-hour time limit they have, but the kind of information they're commanding that be provided is very thorough. And they're not the least bit shy nor retiring about telling people when they turn in those audits every year, you are failing to meet the standard of cyber protections equal to the risk. And that's encouraging. Yes, ma'am.
Ann Walworth, U.S. Treasury's Office of Terrorist Financing and Financial Crimes. Good to see you again. Have you begun to see any role that generative AI is playing in data breaches? And if not, or even if so, how concerned are you about that? It's been getting a lot of attention.
Thank you, Ann, for giving me that softball question. You cannot have a conference and not talk about AI. It's very difficult to pinpoint a specific attack that is AI generated or AI related. We do know that particularly phishing has gotten to be a lot better. You probably have seen it in your own emails and texts and if there's you run across a fake website here and there. Generative AI has cured the issue of bad grammar and bad spelling, and they're actually writing very good scripts, both for social engineering and for just whatever the copy is in that phishing lure. So we do know that it is improving the quality of the phishing lure and the phishing attack. How we do know that because we're hearing from people that they're falling for those more. And even people like us, people who do this for a living, sometimes they're very difficult to tell the difference now. What we're not seeing at scale, and we do not believe we will see at scale, are deep fakes and voice clones for identity crimes. Misinformation, disinformation, do it all day long. But to commit an identity crime, it's too labor intensive for that to be done at scale. And at the end of the day, they're not really interested in anything other than attacks at scale if they're financially motivated. I think that's one of the things we've got to look for is what are the other things that can happen in this space with generative AI? In pure cybersecurity, will it get good at writing malware? It's kind of sucks at writing malware right now, but it could get better. We just have to wait and see. But our position is the real threat is misinformation and disinformation, but we've got to look hard all the time about what could be coming as a result of AI as it improves. And I think that's probably time, isn't it, Jeremy?
I believe it is.
Well, thank you. I'll be here. Be sure and try the veal, tip your server, and look forward to talking to you at the break.
I can ask our panel now, come on up in the panel on the role biometrics can play in devaluing stolen data. James, you're not off the hook yet. You got to get right back up there.
Get up here, James.
Is there an order you want us to set?
From best to worst.
Where's worst?
That's up to you.
Well, then I'll sit in the middle.
Hi, everybody. I'm Jay Meyer. I'm an SVP at a company called FaceTech. We're the leading provider of 3D face liveness and matching technology out there. I'm also honored to have the opportunity to support the Identity Theft Resource Center and their Biometric Advisory Board, and also the Cantera new AI deepfake advisory system.